Welcome to Leaping Larry's Revolutionary Reading Theatre.
Right. Well, welcome. Oh, today we are going to be reading of Leninism. Be starting this one. I'll probably do the intro and maybe the first chapter as well. I think both of those are quite short. So we'll start short. Just dip our toes in today, you know? And then next time when we read, we'll be getting on with the rest of this. It'll be a good little work. And this was chosen by you. Congratulations, all of you. Goes well. So while we're reading this, fun. While we're reading this, while we're reading this as well, I want you to think about the Pat socks, right? And all those fucking messages Noah sent me. And just think about what Lenin and Stalin, what Leninism would have supported, most importantly. Anyways, so which will become most important down here when we get to the national question.
I would have been friends with Stalin.
Yeah, exactly. Didn't even have to have a ping pong table. So, foundations of Leninism. The introduction dedicated to the Lenin enrollment. J.V. Stalin. Production. Foundations of Leninism is a big subject. To exhaust it, a whole volume would be required. Indeed, a whole number of volumes required. Naturally, therefore, my lectures cannot be an exhaustive exposition of Leninism. At best, they can only offer a concise synopsis, foundations of Leninism. Nevertheless, I consider it useful to give this synopsis in order to lay down some basic points of departure necessary for the successful study of Leninism. Expounding the foundations of Leninism still does not mean expounding the basis of Lenin's world outlook. Lenin's world outlook and the foundations of Leninism are not identical in scope. Lenin was a Marxist, and Marxism is, of course, the basis of his world outlook. But from this, it does not at all follow that an exposition of Leninism ought to begin with an exposition of the foundations of Marxism. To expound Leninism means to expound the distinctive and new in the works of Lenin that Lenin contributed to the general treasury of Marxism that is naturally connected with his name. Only in this sense will I speak in my lectures the foundations of Leninism. And so, what is Leninism? Some say that Leninism is the application of Marxism to the conditions that are peculiar to the situation in Russia. Definition contains a particle of truth, but not the whole truth by any means. Lenin, indeed, applied Marxism to Russian conditions, and applied it in a masterly way. But if Leninism were only the application of Marxism to the conditions that are peculiar to Russia, it would be a purely national and only a national, purely Russian and only a Russian phenomenon. We know, however, that Leninism is not merely a Russian, but an international phenomenon, rooted in the whole of international development. That is why I think this definition suffers from one-sidedness. Better not get dogmatic after I read this to you. should have the opposite effect. The opposite effect, god damn it. Others say that Leninism is the revival of the revolutionary elements of Marxism of the 40s of the 19th century, as distinct from Marxism of the subsequent years, when it is alleged it became moderate, non-revolutionary. If we disregard this foolish and vulgar division of the teachings of Marx, two parts, revolutionary, moderate, must admit that even this totally inaccurate and unsatisfactory definition contains a particle of truth. This particle of truth is that Lenin did indeed restore the revolutionary content of Marxism, which had been suppressed by the opportunists of the Second International. Still, that is but a particle of the truth. The whole truth about Leninism is that Leninism not only restored Marxism, but also took a step forward, developing Marxism further under the new conditions of capitalism, the class struggle, proletariat. And this, by the way, is where it is similar in some respects to Juche and different in some respects to Juche. Similar in the sense that Juche as well arose to overcome opportunistic and deviationist trends that that suppress the truth of Marxism-Leninism in our modern era, and which becomes even more of a serious problem after the establishment of a socialist system. Not to say that those problems don't, of course, still exist beforehand, but they become more pronounced. And that's why, as DPRK points out, the limitations of Marxism-Leninism are more revealed after the establishment of a socialist society. That doesn't mean that Marxism-Leninism is wrong in any way. It simply means that there is certain historical limitations. In that Marxism-Leninism exists to analyze existing capitalism and imperialism and teach us the ways to create our guide to overcome it. And then once you get to socialist society, it doesn't have so much to say about socialist society itself as much, and building communism itself, beyond some predictions. And by the way, later when we get to reading Economic Problems of Socialism in USSR by Stalin, you'll see how Stalin is also pointing out this problem. But of course, because of de-Stalinization, but implemented by Khrushchev, basically that work was like just discarded and not ever taken seriously. What then, in the last analysis, is Leninism? Leninism is Marxism of the era of imperialism and the proletarian revolution. To be more exact, Leninism is the theory and tactics of the proletarian revolution in general. The theory and tactics of the dictatorship of the proletariat in particular. Marx and Engels pursued their activities in the pre-revolutionary period. We have the proletarian revolution in mind, when developed imperialism did not yet exist. The period of the proletarians' preparation for revolution. In the period when the proletarian revolution was not yet an immediate practical inevitability. But Lenin, the disciple of Marx and Engels, pursued his activities in the period of developed imperialism, the period of the unfolding proletarian revolution, when the proletarian revolution had already triumphed in one country, smashed bourgeois democracy, and had ushered in the era of proletarian democracy, the era of the Soviets. This is why Leninism is the further development of Marxism. Everybody go follow Lesbian Hot Sauce. Thank you for the lurk, comrade. Welcome in. And by the way, someday we will also read this other thing that I have saved here for you. We'll read this sometime coming up soon. Speaking of for speeches and stuff. But someday we'll go through this work by Grover Furr. Gezov versus Stalin. Causes of the mass repressions of 1937-1938 USSR. That might be a good case study since we did read Lucerdo's History and Critique of a Black Legend before. Although I didn't get it on... I never did get it on YouTube, so maybe we'll have to read it again. It is usual to point to the exceptionally militant and exceptionally revolutionary character of Leninism. Quite correct. This specific feature of Leninism is due to two causes. Firstly, to the fact that Leninism emerged from the proletarian revolution, the imprint of which it cannot but bear. Secondly, to the fact that it grew and became strong in clashes with the opportunism of the Second International, the fight against which was and remains an essential preliminary condition for a successful fight against capitalism. It must not be forgotten that between Marx and Engels one hand and Lenin on the other, there lies a whole period of undivided domination and opportunism of the Second International. And the ruthless struggle against this opportunism could not but constitute one of the most important tasks of Leninism. Indeed, this is Joseph Stalin's Socialist Schoolhouse Pup. We're teaching English today by reading from Foundations of Leninism. Indeed. I'd be interested in discussing Furr. I know he's pretty controversial. Yeah, among liberal academics. Which is fucking funny because Grover Furr puts all of his primary sources, including original translations, in all of the things that he does. So even if you don't agree with him, it's like gotta reckon with the sources that are there either way, you know? But he's too biased, Larry. Yeah. AKA he doesn't meaning that he doesn't, he doesn't parrot the things that we need him to parrot. Oh no, Grover Furr. He's not saying the things about Stalin we needed him to. Basically, I was saying Furr provides all his primary sources, and any liberal academics who try and like bash him or whatever, like they're gotta reckon with the fact that he provides all those sources in his work. So, like, fuck them. What are you? You can read the actual primary sources yourself if you don't like his conclusions. But like, then you got to reckon with like how what you're reading doesn't come to the same conclusions he does. And I find that that's where most people start to get dishonest with Grover Furr. I mean, your opinion, yeah, your opinion, Bob, is only valid. Like your opinion is only valid. Like it's not just anti-Stalin, but there's certain like paradigms that you have to absolutely like subscribe to, right? Like one is anti-Stalin. You have to parrot the that DPRK has a dictator that like a dynasty. Like these are if you don't do these things that adhere to the background assumption, then you'll be looked at as a conspiracy theorist. Oh, plenty of communists bash him who've never even read him, Sebs. Most of the communists I see bashing Furr they cannot demonstrate that they've even read a single thing that Furr's written. So, so yeah, someday we'll read this soon. This is actually a pretty good piece. All right, we'll do one more part of Leninism. Oh, of course. This is, of course, the interactive home for communist learning, Tambalam. We encourage questions highly. We're all here learning together. Not your teacher, I'm your fellow student. Our teacher is the eternal Lenin. Brought up academic censorship over genocide. Motherfucker revealed himself as a rabid Zionist. Tried to deny genocide, just so said, well, what would you do? I would do. Speaking of Lenin walking the world, yep, and I mean Grover Fur's writing is like that in general. That's why I say like most people who like I guess bash him or whatever again like they've never read him. So we'll do that soon. We'll get some other works by him too. How about the historical roots of Leninism now? Leninism grew up and took shape under the conditions of imperialism, when the contradictions of capitalism had reached an extreme point, when the proletarian revolution had become an immediate practical question, when the old period of preparation of the working class for revolution had arrived at and passed into a new period, that of direct assault on capitalism. Lenin called imperialism moribund capitalism. Why? Because imperialism carries the contradictions of capitalism to their last bounds, to the extreme limit, beyond which revolution begins. Of these contradictions, there are three which must be regarded as the most important. First contradiction is the contradiction between labor and capital. Imperialism is the omnipotence of the monopolist trusts and syndicates, of the banks and the financial oligarchy, the industrial countries. To fight against this omnipotence, the customary methods of the working class trade union cooperatives, parliamentary parties, and parliamentary struggles have proved to be totally inadequate. Either place yourself at the mercy of capital, eke out a wretched existence as of old, and sink lower and lower, or adopt a new weapon. This is the alternative imperialism put before the vast masses of the proletariat. Imperialism brings the working class revolution. The second contradiction, the contradiction among the various financial groups and imperialist powers in their struggle for sources of raw materials, foreign territory. Imperialism is the export of capital to sources of raw materials, the frenzied struggle for the monopolist position of these, struggle for a redivision of the already divided world, struggle waged with particular fury by new financial groups, powers, seeking a place in the sun, against the old groups and powers, which cling tenaciously to what they have seized. This frenzied struggle among the various groups of capitalists is notable in that it includes as an inevitable element imperialist wars. Wars for the annexation of foreign territory. This circumstance, in its turn, is notable in that it leads to the mutual weakening of the imperialists, to the weakening of the position of capitalism in general, the exhilaration of the advent of the proletarian revolution, and to the practical necessity of this revolution. Now, this is the one part where, of course, Juche comes and says that there has been development since this, right? And while it is still true that imperialism, of course, inevitably brings war, it brings war not out of not out of contest with other imperialist powers anymore. Generally speaking, and pretty much, and because of the heightened death throes that imperialism finds itself under at this point, imperialism is basically decided that all of these imperialist powers need to settle their disagreements in other means other than open armed conflict, which does leave open the door for armed revolution to win, and instead they have to direct their assault at any sort of any sort of movement that is trying to get out from underneath this imperialist system, whether it is explicitly a socialist revolution or whether it is just a liberatory struggle, which, as we know, is a step towards socialist revolution, right? And like to quote like Jay from the other day, like what has led historically, so it's still true as well that revolution or that the counter revolutionaries, that imperialists going around and fighting all of these movements to try and get out from the imperialist system is itself still um, pushing forward revolutionary struggle all over the world, right? It at the same time accelerates the revolutionary struggle. There's that great quote by Che that I think is really relevant here. We will just grab that right quick before with the third country. Right here. But it was not capitalism's internal contradictions that, having exhausted all possibilities, caused the system to explode. Struggle for liberation from a foreign oppressor, misery caused by external events such as war, consequences privileged classes place on the backs of the exploited, liberation movements that overthrow neo-colonial. These are the usual factors unleashing this kind of explosion. Conscious action does the rest. Speaking of where revolutions have occurred. So important to note that this is still somewhat true, although imperialist countries don't really enter into open armed conflicts with each other anymore because they have learned that that is risking the entire system. And in fact, they're just so focused on containing any sort of liberatory movement. And with China, the rise of China and DPRK, Vietnam, their continued development is like not only providing the not only is providing like the example of is still providing like the bad example, the risk of the bad example, but now is also like able to provide things, trade, where imperialists are not even able to. Why they're becoming um more and more brazen with just like, for example, Russia vetoing the sanctions against DPRK not that long ago, right? Not vetoing the sanctions, but vetoing in one ability of the imperialists to police those sanctions. The third contradiction is the contradiction between a handful of civilized nations, the hundreds of millions of colonial and dependent peoples of the world. Imperialism is the most barefaced exploitation, the most inhumane oppression of hundreds of people, inhabiting vast colonies and dependent countries. The purpose of this exploitation and of this oppression squeeze out super profits. But in exploiting these countries, imperialism is compelled to build these railways, factories, mills, industrial and commercial centers. The appearance of a class of proletarians, the emergence of a native intelligentsia, the awakening of national consciousness, the growth of liberation movement. Such are the inevitable results of this policy, quote unquote. The growth of revolutionary movement in all colonies, dependent countries, without exception, clearly testifies to this fact. This circumstance is of importance for the proletariat inasmuch as it saps radically the position of capitalism by converting the colonies and dependent countries from reserves of imperialism to reserves of proletarian revolution. Such, in general, are the principal contradictions of imperialism, which have converted the old, flourishing capitalism into moribund capitalism. Flourishing in quotes, by the way. Significance of the imperialist war, which broke out 10 years ago, lies, among other things, in the fact that it gathered all of these contradictions in thought, threw them on the scales, thereby accelerating and facilitating the revolutionary battles of the proletariat. In other words, imperialism was instrumental not only in making the revolution a practical inevitability, but also in creating favorable conditions for a direct assault on the citadels of capitalism. Such was the international situation that gave birth to Leninism. Some may say this is all very well, but what has it to do with Russia? It was not and could not be a classical land of imperialism. What has it to do with Lenin? Worked primarily in Russia and for Russia. Why did Russia, of all countries, become the home of Leninism, the birthplace of the theory and tactics of the proletarian revolution? Because Russia was the focus of all these contradictions of imperialism. As Russia, more than any other country, pregnant with revolution, and she alone, therefore, was in a position to solve those contradictions in a revolutionary way. To begin with, Tsarist Russia was the home of every kind of oppression, capitalist, colonial, militarist, its most inhumane and barbarous form. Who does not know that in Russia the omnipotence of capital, combined with the despotism of Tsarism, the aggressiveness of Russian nationalism, Tsarism's role of executioner in regard to the non-Russian people, the exploitation of entire regions, Turkey, Persia, China, the seizure of these regions by Tsarism, with wars of conquest. Lenin was right in saying that Tsarism was military feudal imperialism. Tsarism was the concentration of the worst features of imperialism, raised to a high pitch. Yeah, exactly, Bob. Oh, it's hilarious. Which is what I'm saying. Like when you read Stalin, when we're reading this, you'll see how fucked up the Pat Sox have it. Hey Kay, welcome in. Shout out to Kay. How do you say? Everybody, go follow Kay. To proceed, Tsarist Russia was a major reserve of Western imperialism, not only in the sense that it gave free entry to foreign capital, controlled such basic branches of Russia's national economy as the fuel and metallurgical industries, but also in the sense that it could supply the Western imperialists with millions of soldiers. Remember that Russia army, 14 million strong, would shed its blood on the imperialist fronts to safeguard the staggering profits of the British, French capitalists. Red Falcon leveling up with the unique chatter award. Welcome in, comrade. Get a shout out for Red Falcon as well once we get
Let's go, smokes.
Hell yeah, Meg. I'll tell you what. My reward for reading this will be smoking some of the. We'll be smoking some of the thing. So I appreciate that. Yeah, hell yeah. As soon as we're done reading this chapter, we'll smoke a smoker. Hey Frank, welcome in, welcome in. Great to see you. Further, Tsarism was not only the watchdog of imperialism in the east of Europe, but in addition, it was the agent of Western imperialism for squeezing out the population, hundreds of millions by way of intra loans obtained in Paris and London, Berlin, and Brussels. Finally, Tsarism was a most faithful ally of Western imperialism. The partition of Turkey, Persia, China, etc. Who does not know that the imperialist war was waged by Tsarism in alliance with the imperialists of the Andante, and that Russia was an essential element in that war? By the way, if you didn't know, just after Russian Revolution found success and captured state power, the Bolsheviks, they drove through the streets with papers detailing all of the secret dealings between the various powers that were engaged in the imperialist war. That made the imperialists mad. Yes, it did. Are there degrees to being spladled, or is 100% or nothing? There might be degrees. I feel like that's an extra big spladling that Lenin gave the imperialists with that one. Printing those secret detailings of their backdoor dealings during the imperialist war. That was a pretty good one. That is why the interests of Tsarism and of Western imperialism were interwoven and ultimately became merged in a single skein of imperialist interests. Could Western imperialism resign itself to the loss of such powerful support in the East and of such a rich reservoir of manpower and resources as old, Tsarist, bourgeois Russia was, without exerting all its strength, wage a life and death struggle against the revolution in Russia with the object of defending and preserving Tsarism? Of course not. But from this it follows that whoever wanted to strike at Tsarism necessarily raised his hand against imperialism. Whoever rose against Tsarism had to rise against imperialism as well. For whoever was bent on overthrowing Tsarism had to overthrow imperialism too. If he really intended not merely to defeat Tsarism, but to make a clean sweep of it, thus the revolution against Tsarism verged on, had to pass into a revolution against imperialism, to proletarian revolution. Meanwhile, in Russia, a tremendous popular revolution was rising, headed by the most revolutionary proletariat in the world, which possessed such an important ally as the revolutionary peasantry of Russia. Does it need proof that such a revolution could not stop halfway? That in the event of success, it was bound to advance further, raise the banner of revolt against imperialism. That is why Russia was bound to become the focus of the contradictions of imperialism. Not only in the sense that it was in Russia that these contradictions were revealed most plainly in view of their particular repulsive and particularly intolerable character, and not only because Russia was a highly important prop of Western imperialism, connecting Western finance capital with the colonies in the East, but also because Russia, the only country in which there existed a real force capable of resolving the contradictions of imperialism in a revolutionary way. From this it follows, however, that the revolution in Russia could not but become a proletarian revolution, that from its very inception it could not but assume an international character, and that, therefore, it could not but shake the very foundations of world imperialism. Under these circumstances, could the Russian communists confine their work within the narrow national bounds of the Russian Revolution? Of course not. On the contrary, the whole situation, both internal, profound revolutionary crisis, and external, the war, impelled them to go beyond these bounds in their work, to transfer the struggle to the international arena, to expose the ulcers of imperialism, prove that the collapse of capitalism was inevitable, smash social chauvinism, social pacifism, and finally to overthrow capitalism in their own country, to forge a new fighting weapon for the proletariat. Theory and tactics of the proletarian revolution in order to facilitate the task of overthrowing capitalism for the proletarians of all countries. Nor could the Russian communists act otherwise, for only this path offered the chance of producing certain changes in the international situation that could safeguard Russia against the restoration of the bourgeois order. That is why Russia became the home of Leninism, and why Lenin, the leader of the Russian communists, became its creator. By the way, if you want to know about where things went wrong, I recommend you check out my other read that I did called Fundamentals of Revolutionary Party Building by Kim Jong-il. And at the end of this, I'll show you where to get my other read. The same thing, approximately, happened in the case of Russia and Lenin, as in the case of Germany and Marx and Engels in the 40s of the last century. Germany at that time was pregnant with bourgeois revolution, just like Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. Marx wrote at that time in the Communist Manifesto, quote, Marx now, the communists turned their attention chiefly to Germany, because that country is on the eve of bourgeois revolution that is bound to be carried out under more advanced conditions of European civilization, and with a much more developed proletariat than that of England was in the 17th, and of France in the 18th century, and because the bourgeois revolution in Germany will be but the prelude to an immediately following proletarian revolution. In other words, the center of the revolutionary movement was shifting to Germany. There can hardly be any doubt that it was this very circumstance, noted by Marx in the above quoted passage, that served as the probable reason why it was precisely Germany that became the birthplace of scientific socialism, and why the leaders of the German proletariat, Marx and Engels, became its creators. The same, only to a still greater degree, must be said of Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. It would be a good idea. Russia was then on the eve of a bourgeois revolution. She had to accomplish this revolution at a time when conditions in Europe were more advanced, and with a proletariat that was more developed than that of Germany in the 40s of the 19th, let alone Britain and France. Moreover, all the evidence went to show that this revolution was bound to serve as a ferment and as a prelude to the proletarian revolution. We cannot regard it as accidental that as early as 1902, Russian Revolution was still in an embryonic state. Lenin wrote the prophetic words in his pamphlet, What is to be Done? Quote, History has now confronted us, i.e. the Russian Marxists, with an immediate task, which is the most revolutionary of all the immediate tasks that confront the proletariat of any country, and that fulfillment of this task, destruction of the most powerful bulwark, not only of European, but also, it may now be said, of Asiatic reaction, would make the Russian proletariat the vanguard of the international revolutionary proletariat. In other words, the center of the revolutionary movement was bound to shift to Russia. As we know, the course of the revolution in Russia has more than vindicated Lenin's prediction. Is it surprising, after all this, that a country which has accomplished such a revolution, possesses such a proletariat, should have been the birthplace of the theory and tactics of the proletarian revolution? Is it surprising that Lenin, the leader of Russia's proletariat, became also the creator of this theory and tactics of the leader of the international proletariat? Salute to the leader of the international proletariat. Here you go. Okay, next time we will read Chapter 2, Method. Now, if you are looking for reads that we have already done in the past and where I will be putting this one, just come right here to my channel